This is a story about quiet loyalty, the kind that stays long after applause disappears. It's about faith that holds on when the road gives no promises back. George Green felt the cold before he felt awake. Detroit mornings did that to you, especially the day after Christmas. The streets looked emptied out, like the city itself needed a moment to breathe after pretending to celebrate. George pulled his jacket tighter as he loaded the last package into the van, fingers stiff, movements slower than they used to be. The clock on the dashboard read 6:11 a.m. He stared at it longer than necessary. I could have taken today off, he thought. But he didn't turn the key right away. He never rushed that part. Starting the engine had always felt symbolic, like agreeing, again, to a life that asked more than it explained. The engine coughed once, twice, then settled. George exhaled. The first streets were quiet. Snow piled along curbs, gray and tired, like it had already lived too long. Christmas decorations still hung in windows, blinking weakly, forgotten. George drove slowly, careful not to rush the silence away. He had been delivering packages for most of his adult life. Same routes, same neighborhoods, same nods from people who never learned his name but trusted him with their doors unlocked. Honest work, they called it. George believed in that. Or at least he had built his life around the idea that it was enough. Still, as the van rolled forward, a thought slipped in, unwelcome, persistent. What if this is all it ever amounts to? He tightened his hands on the steering wheel and kept driving. At a red light near 8 Mile, George caught his reflection in the side mirror. 59. Lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 10 years ago. A calm expression that came from learning not to expect much. He thought of Pam at home, probably awake already, feeding Gary before the cat started complaining loudly about being ignored. Of Lisa and Ben, grown now, building lives that didn't require his constant steadiness anymore. He was proud of that. And yet, some mornings, like this one, he wondered who he was without the deliveries, without the routine, without the quiet role of being dependable. The light turned green. George pressed the accelerator gently, not to move faster, but to move forward. The first package of the day sat beside him on the passenger seat. Nothing special. Brown cardboard. Ordinary address. George glanced at it briefly, then back to the road. He didn't know yet that this ordinary morning, the cold, the silence, the familiar streets, was already beginning to bend. That the years of staying, of choosing the same path when leaving would have been understandable, were about to be seen differently. For now, all George knew was this. He showed up, again, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain, that felt heavier and more important than it ever had before. George made his first stop just after 7. The house sat low and quiet, porch lights still on, snow untouched except for a narrow path to the door. George parked carefully, killed the engine, and sat for a moment with the package in his lap. He always did this, gave the moment a second to settle. Rushing made mistakes, and mistakes followed you home. He stepped out into the cold, boots crunching softly. The air smelled like metal and old snow. Detroit held on to winter longer than it needed to. He left the package by the door, squared it neatly, then knocked once, lightly. Not enough to startle, just enough to say I was here. No answer. George nodded to himself and walked back to the van. By mid-morning, his route had carried him through neighborhoods that felt like chapters of his own life. Streets where kids used to wave at the truck. Houses where people once offered coffee through half-open doors. Places that had aged quietly alongside him. He remembered when Lisa was small and would wait by the window on days he came home early. Halbin used to ask if George ever got lost. Not really, George had told him. You just learned to pay attention. That had been the truth then. It still was. At a stoplight downtown, George watched a younger courier jog past his van, earbuds in, moving fast like time owed him something. George smiled faintly. He had moved like that once, back when speed felt like progress, before he learned that showing up, day after day, without drama or complaint, was its own kind of discipline. The light changed. George eased forward. Around noon, his phone buzzed. A text from Pam. Soup's on the stove. Don't rush. George felt the familiar warmth spread through his chest. Pam had always understood the rhythm of his days better than anyone. She knew when to talk, when to wait, when to trust that he would come back, carrying whatever the road handed him. He typed back slowly, almost halfway. It wasn't just about the route. As the afternoon crept closer, George noticed something he hadn't expected. He wasn't as tired. The cold still bit. His joints still ached. But there was a steadiness in him that hadn't been there before, like the years of repetition had quietly built something solid underneath the doubt. He didn't know what that meant yet, only that this day, so ordinary it almost felt invisible, was pressing on him with a strange kind of importance. As if the road he had stayed faithful to for so long was finally preparing to speak back. Not loudly, just clearly enough for someone like George to hear. The call came while George was parked behind a grocery store, engine idling low. He almost ignored it. Unknown number, middle of a route. Those calls usually meant trouble, missed scans, delays, explanations that went nowhere. George stared at the vibrating phone, then sighed and answered. George Green, the voice asked. Male. Calm. Careful. Yes. This is Mark Delaney from Regional Operations. I hope I'm not interrupting. George looked at the dashboard clock. 1:42 p.m., I've got a minute. There was a pause, just long enough to feel deliberate. We've been reviewing delivery data from the last few years, Mark said. Consistency, customer feedback, missed claims. Patterns. George waited. Years on the road had taught him not to fill silence too quickly. You've run one of the cleanest routes in the region, Mark continued. No incidents. No complaints. And when there were issues, weather, delays, you handled them quietly. Quietly. The word landed heavier than praise. I just do my job, George said. Yes, Mark replied. That's why I'm calling. They met later, not in an office, but at a small warehouse near the edge of George's route. No ceremony, just folding chairs and a clipboard. Mark was younger than George had expected. Sharp-eyed, tired in a different way. We're restructuring some things, Mark explained. Training, mentorship. We lose a lot of drivers early. They burn out, get careless, quit. George nodded. He'd seen it. We need someone steady, Mark said. Someone who understands the road without fighting it. George felt a tightening in his chest. Not fear, but recognition. I'm not a manager, he said carefully. Mark smiled. Good. We don't need one. George finished the rest of his route on autopilot. Not because he wasn't paying attention, but because his body knew what to do while his mind tried to catch up. The years replayed themselves in fragments. Missed dinners, cold mornings, packages delivered without thanks, faith practiced without witnesses. Had it all been leading here? Or was this just another test, another moment where hope needed to be handled carefully? At home that evening, George told Pam everything while Gary wound himself around their ankles, demanding attention. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she reached for his hand. I always wondered when they'd notice, she said softly. George shook his head. I didn't. Pam smiled. That's why they did. Later, lying awake in the quiet house, George stared at the ceiling. For the first time in years, the question wasn't was it worth it? It was something else entirely. What if the staying was never the mistake? The thought didn't answer everything, but it made room, for the first time, for something like peace. The next morning felt different before George could explain why. Same alarm, same coffee, same winter light struggling through the kitchen window. And yet, his hands moved slower, more deliberate, as if some part of him had decided this day deserved attention. Pam watched him from the counter. You're quiet, she said. George smiled faintly. Just thinking. She nodded. After all these years, she knew when not to press. The meeting was scheduled for noon. George parked outside the warehouse 10 minutes early and stayed in the van, engine off, listening to the cooling metal tick beneath the hood. He had delivered to this building 100 times, never once stepping inside. Today, the door was open. Mark greeted him with a handshake and led him past stacks of parcels and humming machinery. The place smelled like cardboard and diesel, familiar, grounding. They sat across from each other at a folding table. "No big speech," Mark said. "No promises we can't keep." George appreciated that. "We want you to take over route oversight," Mark continued. "Men are new drivers. Help fix problems before they become issues. Fewer miles, more stability." George listened carefully. Asked questions, practical ones, about schedules, about responsibility, about what happened if it didn't work. Mark answered honestly. That mattered. When the offer was made, it wasn't dramatic. Just a nod, a sheet of paper, a simple question, "What do you think?" George looked down at his hands. Hands that had carried boxes in the dark, signed forms in the cold, knocked on doors without expecting them to open. "I won't rush people," he said slowly. "And I won't pretend this job is easy." Mark smiled. "That's exactly what we're hoping for." George finished his route that afternoon with an unfamiliar feeling, lightness. The work was the same, the streets unchanged, but something inside him had shifted. The years no longer felt like proof of being overlooked. They felt like credentials. That evening, he walked in the door before sunset. Pam looked up, surprised. "You're early. Looks like I might be more often," George said. She didn't speak right away, just stepped forward and hugged him, tight and quiet. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and steady, covering the old marks on the road. George watched it through the window and understood something at last. The years hadn't been wasted. They had been preparing him for a moment that didn't arrive loudly, but arrived honestly. And that, he realized, was exactly how faith was supposed to work. George's first week in the new role passed quietly. No announcements, no congratulations that echoed down hallways. Just work, different work, but familiar in its honesty. He rode along with new drivers, listening more than he spoke. He showed them how to slow down without falling behind, how to notice the small things that kept bigger problems away, how to knock once, gently, because respect mattered, even when no one was watching. Some listened, some didn't. George didn't take it personally. He had learned long ago that seeds took time. On Friday evening, he finished earlier than he ever had before. The sky over Detroit was already dimming, winter light folding itself away. George drove home through streets he had known for decades, now seeing them with a strange new clarity, not as checkpoints on a route, but as places where life had happened alongside his own. Pam met him at the door, smiling when she saw the time. "Still daylight," she said. George nodded. "Feels different." They ate dinner together, unhurried. Lisa called to talk about work. Ben asked for advice he didn't realize he'd been waiting to hear. Gary curled up on George's lap, finally satisfied with the attention he demanded daily. Nothing about the evening was extraordinary, and yet it felt complete. Later, George stepped outside alone. Snow fell lightly, the kind that softened everything it touched. He breathed in the cold air and thought back to the morning after Christmas. The silence, the doubt, the familiar question he had carried for years. What if this is all it ever amounts to? Now, standing there, he understood the answer. It had amounted to showing up, to staying honest when leaving would have been easier, to faith practiced quietly, without guarantees. Life hadn't rewarded him with applause. It had rewarded him with peace. George went back inside, closing the door gently behind him. Tomorrow would come. Work would continue. But for the first time, the road no longer felt like something he had to endure. It felt like something that had led him, patiently, faithfully, right where he was meant to be.